The silence after the transmission died was a sound no one had trained for. It wasn't static. It wasn't an emergency beacon or a warning. It was just absence. A void where 300 voices used to be. Engineers, soldiers, families. The station on Ganymede had vanished, and there was no explosion, no distress signal. Just a blackout, like someone had switched off a light and forgotten to turn it back on. Surveillance from Earth orbit showed the station still standing. But when long-range visuals came through, the buildings were gutted. Structures folded in on themselves like paper soaked in oil. Walls melted without heat signatures. The bodies, if they existed, were not visible from space. It wasn't a bombing. It was something else. Something cleaner. Quieter. More precise. The military's response was fast. Quarantine protocol. A Black Ops recovery fleet was dispatched without public notice. The official statement called it a communications failure. But no one believed that. Not after what had happened to the Mars Observatory 3 months earlier. Not after the missing crew from the asteroid outpost. This wasn't the first time. Just the first time it was undeniable. The ship entered Ganymede orbit with jammers running and countermeasures on standby. No lights. No pings. Radio silence. Just the cold hum of the hull and the slow breathing of soldiers who knew too well what silence meant. They didn't land immediately. Scans came first. Buildings were intact. Power was off. But traces of heat remained, localized, inconsistent. Something was still moving. Something small, coordinated. Not human. The signatures moved in groups of 3. Always 3. Never more. Never less. When boots touched ground, the dust rose in silence. No gunfire. No sirens. Just the sound of metal against frost. The streets were too quiet. Too clean. No blood. No debris. Just scratch marks on steel and long black trails where something had dragged something else. The first body was found near the outer dome. Or what was left of it. There was no armor. No uniform. Just muscle, peeled and curled like petals. Organs missing. No signs of struggle. No blunt force. No weapon fire. Just surgical disassembly. As if the person had laid down and allowed it. The squad didn't speak. The footage fed directly to command. Audio muted. The body was tagged and sealed, but the scanners went haywire trying to analyze it. It wasn't decomposing. It wasn't preserved either. Something in the tissue resisted analysis, like it was meant to remain unreadable. Further in, the lights began to flicker. Motion detectors fired off at every angle. But nothing came close. Whatever moved did so just outside visual range, teasing visibility before slipping away again. The shadows weren't just darker, they moved wrong. Like they were bending around something invisible. Then came the first scream. Cut short. A burst of sound, then silence. When they reached the location, only the rifle remained. Still warm. No blood. Just a trail, like a large snake had slithered away, dragging its prey. Orders shifted. Fall back. Regroup. Recon only. But it was too late. The second squad was ambushed. 3 of them taken in less than 10 seconds. Thermal cameras caught shapes, tall, thin, multi-limbed, moving in a blur. Their armor wasn't metal. It flexed. Shifted. Reacted to light. It was alive. Not grown, but not forged either. Some kind of synthesis. A perfect adaptation. Bullets worked. Plasma burned. But they never fired twice at the same target. The moment one went down, another flanked from behind. They weren't just fast. They were learning. Every minute. By day 3, half the team was gone. Not dead. Gone. No remains. No bodies. Only the occasional crackle of a distorted radio call. Like someone was trying to speak but couldn't remember how to form words. Command wanted answers. What were they? What did they want? No one could say. They didn't take equipment. They didn't touch food or fuel. They avoided technology. They only came when they were watched. As if they could feel observation. Then one of them died in full view. It dropped from the ceiling, lunged, and was shot mid-air. The corpse hit the floor and convulsed. But it didn't scream. It didn't resist. It pulsed. As if something inside it was signaling. The armor retracted. The limbs curled. And from beneath the surface, a network of filaments spread like veins across the ground, seeking contact. One soldier torched it. Flame worked. Intense, full thermal destruction. The filaments screamed as they burned. Not audibly, but on every frequency the scanners could detect. A death cry across the spectrum. And then, everything changed. The next attack was different. Not stealth. Not quiet. Dozens of them, swarming. No tactics. Just violence. They weren't hunting anymore. They were retaliating. But they underestimated the one thing they couldn't adapt to. Humans don't run from extinction. They rage against it. The fire spread quickly through the maintenance corridors, igniting old wiring and oxygen residue. For a brief moment, the flicker of the flames gave the surviving soldiers something they hadn't had since landing: visibility. The enemy, whatever it was, didn't like open flame. It pulled back. It hissed, not from fear, but from pain. Pain meant limits. Limits meant vulnerability. The survivors regrouped at the central reactor hub, using welding torches and fuel canisters to build crude flame traps. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't pretty. But it worked. The next wave came and met fire. They still fought, charging through the heat, losing limbs, liquefying flesh. But the difference now was that they didn't retreat with trophies. They fell. The tactics changed again. The attacks slowed. They watched from above, through vents, through security glass, through tiny slits in the darkness. Always watching. Always learning. A pattern emerged. They weren't trying to win the battle. They were studying the response. They wanted to see what humans would do under pressure. Not to mimic it. Not to stop it. But to understand it. That was the most terrifying part. They weren't attacking out of hunger or territory. They were observing. Recording. Testing. Then came the sound. Not a screech, not a roar. A low, rhythmic thrum. Like a heartbeat, broadcast through the walls. It vibrated through boots. It echoed in skulls. It wasn't sound. It was signal. A frequency designed to bypass hearing and touch the brainstem directly. Soldiers felt nausea. Memories blurred. Some began to hallucinate. One walked into the fire without a scream. Whatever the species was, it had mastered more than weapons. It had mastered perception. It knew how to unmake a mind without firing a shot. But then something happened that it hadn't accounted for. Humans adapted back. The survivors rigged neural dampeners, stripped from mining equipment. They used sound-canceling helmets, painkillers, cold showers, anything to dull the effect of the frequency. It didn't block it, but it gave clarity long enough to think. To act. And they acted fast. They located the pulse source deep below the station, under the research wing that had never been on the original blueprints. Someone had been digging. Before the attack. Before the silence. Not for ore or water. For a signal. Old equipment showed traces of an ancient frequency buried in the moon's crust. Something not natural. Not random. A pattern older than Earth's written language. Something calling out into the void, long before humans ever arrived. They didn't just find the signal. They responded to it. And that's what brought the monsters. This wasn't an invasion. It was a retrieval. The creatures weren't aliens in the traditional sense. They didn't come in ships. They didn't arrive with banners or threats. They emerged from somewhere deeper, another layer of reality. A place humans weren't meant to touch. But someone did. And once the veil tore, they stepped through. Not curious. Not angry. Just inevitable. The team decided to destroy the origin point. The signal array. But it was too late. The pulsing had changed. Louder now. More direct. As if it had found what it was searching for. One of the engineers tried to shut it down, but his hands began to tremble. His eyes bled. He screamed in a language he didn't know. They shot him before he could finish speaking. The machines weren't responding to human commands anymore. The signal had overwritten the systems. It pulsed through the entire station. Every powered door, every interface, every sensor was now part of the network. And the creatures moved through it not physically, but informationally. They didn't need corridors. They flowed like data. Like thought. The plan changed again. Manual overload. Blow the core. Level the site. They set charges, prepped the reactor, began the countdown. Not all of them would make it out. They knew that. There was no time to argue. There was only time to finish the mission. Then came the final wave. They didn't attack from one side this time. They emerged from the floors. The walls. The very structure of the station. It was as if they had become part of the architecture, not phasing through, but growing from it. Limbs stretched from wall panels. Eyes opened along steel beams. There was no strategy left. Just chaos. The soldiers fought with fire and fury. Screams echoed across every channel. But they kept going. They held the line. Not because they expected to live, but because they refused to give these things a complete victory. They detonated the charges. The station collapsed inward, fire licking at its edges. The shockwave rolled across Ganymede's crust, sending debris into low orbit. Silence returned. But the signal didn't stop. It pulsed beneath the surface, deep and ancient. Waiting for the next touch. The debris cloud shimmered in Jupiter's shadow, broken steel and molten glass catching the planet's light. From orbit, it looked like a spark had been snuffed out. To most back home, it would go unnoticed: a communications array failure or a collapsed mining shaft. But those who were watching closely, who had seen the footage before the blackouts, knew the truth. Ganymede wasn't lost to a natural disaster. It had been consumed. The retrieval ship held its course, engines cold, signature suppressed. Inside, the last survivors sat in silence. Breathing ragged. Wounds untreated. They didn't speak, not because of fear, but because the words hadn't yet returned to them. What they saw wasn't something the mind could easily put into language. What they heard would never stop echoing in their skulls. Decontamination took longer than expected. Not because of biohazards, but because the onboard systems kept triggering proximity alerts. The scans came up clean, yet the ship's AI flagged anomalies. Movement outside the hull. Temperature fluctuations in sealed chambers. Shadow artifacts in the security feed. Engineers pulled the feeds offline. Not for safety, for sanity. The signal had followed them. It pulsed beneath their thoughts. Faint. Like a memory just out of reach. When they dreamed, it sharpened. The same rhythm. The same frequency. Calling. Not in words, but in instinct. As if part of them had been rewritten during the fight, reprogrammed to listen. One of the crew began scratching at the wall during sleep cycles. Not carving. Tracing. Shapes. Curves. Symbols that didn't match any known language. At first, they erased them. Then they scanned them. And when the linguists tried to decode it, they stopped sleeping too. The decision was made to isolate the survivors. Psych evaluations were inconclusive. Their vital signs were stable, but neural scans showed altered brain activity in identical patterns. Shared anomalies. Some sort of echo across multiple individuals. The result wasn't madness. It was synchronization. Command denied the request to euthanize. They were still human. Weren't they? The black site on Europa received the transport in silence. No welcome team. No questions. Just a debrief terminal and a pair of armed guards in reinforced suits. The moment the ship docked, communications were cut. Containment protocols were activated. The survivors were stripped, scanned, and restrained. But one of them never made it to the cell. He disappeared between airlocks. Cameras went dark for 8 seconds. When they came back online, the hallway was clean. Not a trace. No residue. No sign of tampering. Just gone. The guards claimed they heard humming, a low vibration, almost beneath hearing range. When they described it to the techs, every detail matched the Ganymede frequency. The base went to blackout. No signals in. None out. They still assumed it was a contagion. An infection. Something that could be isolated, sterilized. They didn't understand. It wasn't in the body. It was in the pattern. The signal didn't infect tissue. It rewrote perception. It changed the way the brain saw the universe. Once heard, it couldn't be unheard. Once understood, it couldn't be forgotten. That was the danger. Not the creatures, not the violence. The knowledge itself. 2 of the scientists locked themselves in a research pod and vented the atmosphere. Another one went blind, not physically, but mentally. He refused to open his eyes. Said light moved wrong. Said the angles were speaking to him. They strapped him down. He died 36 hours later. The last recording he made was an audio file. Not speech. Just humming. The same rhythm as the Ganymede pulse. The file was deleted. But it wasn't the only copy. It had already synced with the base network. The pulse spread through encrypted systems. Not fast. Just steady. Like it was waiting. Back on Earth, reports trickled in. Miners from Phobos began showing signs of disassociation. A technician at the Titan comms relay carved a spiral into his chest with a screwdriver. Deep space scouts near the Kuiper belt stopped responding. One final message came in. We see it now. It's not in space. It's beneath it. The project was terminated. Funding pulled. Access restricted. But it didn't matter. The signal was no longer confined. It had made contact. And now, it was listening. The moon base shut down all outbound communication lines. No one was allowed to leave. Not until they could confirm the signal hadn't spread beyond the data cores. But no confirmation came. The deeper the technicians searched, the more they realized the signal wasn't stored anywhere. It wasn't in the code. It was in the hardware. The metal itself resonated faintly. The signal had embedded into the atomic lattice of the alloys. Burn the circuits, and it would hum from the casing. Smash the casing, and it would echo from the dust point. One of the engineers finally said it out loud. This wasn't technology. It was infection by pattern. The pulse wasn't a transmission. It was a frequency-based language. A recursive equation that wrote itself into whatever it touched. Thought. Flesh. Stone. Data. All the same. Just vessels. A crew of demolition specialists was flown in under the cover of a logistics update. Their mission was simple: destroy the entire outpost. No salvage. No recovery. Just erasure. But they were already too late. By the time they arrived, 13 of the base personnel were missing. No breach alarms had been triggered. No shuttle launches recorded. They had simply stopped existing between camera frames. Those who remained refused to sleep. They moved mechanically. Ate the same food at the same time. Walked the same steps in looped patterns. Eyes dilated. Expressions vacant. No one said the word, but everyone thought it. Possession. It didn't happen like in the old stories. No crawling voices. No black ooze. Just patterns. Frequencies. A song only the brain could hear. And once it got in, it never came out. The demolitions team laid charges, but nothing detonated. The explosives were inert. The timers reset themselves. Systems refused to arm. Wires rerouted on their own. When they opened one of the control panels, they found unfamiliar filaments winding through the circuitry, thin, metallic vines that pulsed faintly, alive with the signal. Not wires. Not organic. Something in between. Self-directing. Self-healing. The base wasn't just infected. It was growing. One of the team members screamed during a systems test. Not out of fear, but rage. He clawed at his eyes and shouted that he couldn't stop seeing the pattern. He described impossible geometry. Curves that didn't end. Angles that closed into themselves. Shapes that weren't shapes, but memories. Ideas wrapped in logic too dense to hold. They sedated him. He died with his eyes open and his pupils gone. That was when the order came from Earth. Containment was no longer the priority. Eradication was. A nuclear payload was dispatched from a stealth cruiser orbiting Callisto. The mission was to be handled with no human interaction, fully automated. The bomb would be dropped and detonated remotely. No approach. No retrieval. Just fire and silence. But as the cruiser approached Europa, its signal began to shift. Telemetry glitched. Commands were acknowledged, but not executed. Then came the final message. A single ping. Encoded in the same recursive structure as the original pulse. The crew aboard Earth's command deck stared at the screen. The realization hit slowly. The cruiser wasn't responding. It was singing. And then, just like that, it disappeared from radar. No explosion. No debris. Just one final wave of signal. The pulse wasn't isolated. It had traveled. They had thought Ganymede was the beginning. It wasn't. It was the echo. The real source was deeper. Older. Buried not under rock or ice, but under history. Myths. The strange whispers recorded by early deep space missions. The moments when astronauts swore they saw movement in the void. The dreams that plagued colonists on Titan. The ghost signals from probes that went too far. It had always been there. Waiting. Watching. Learning. And now, it was awake. But something unexpected happened next. The humans stopped running. Not all of them. Some still hid behind protocol, behind denial, behind their own fear. But a few, those who had seen the darkness and survived it, began to fight back. Not with bullets. Not with bombs. With signal. They mimicked the frequency. Studied the pattern. Fed it corrupted data. Injected entropy into its symmetry. Disrupted its perfection. And for the first time, the pulse wavered. Just slightly. But it was enough. The enemy could adapt. But so could humans. More than any species before. Because pain wasn't new to humanity. Neither was madness. They had lived with chaos for centuries. Waged war against their own kind long before any alien threat arrived. They didn't fear annihilation. They turned it into a weapon. The signal trembled. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was confusion. A flicker in the recursive rhythm. A pause between perfect pulses. Something had disrupted the song. A false note. A corruption. And it wasn't random. It was human. The analysts at the defense complex had begun feeding noise into the signal loop's irregular patterns, human-designed chaos algorithms, errors by intention. Poetry in binary. Emotional contradiction mapped to digital code. Rage. Grief. Spite. Illogic made manifest. And the signal flinched. The enemy operated on symmetry. On precision. On total understanding of form and pattern. But humans had evolved in noise. They made meaning from error. They thrived in contradiction. To the enemy, that wasn't a strength. It was impossible. And that impossibility was the first real weapon. The next mission was no longer recovery or destruction. It was infiltration. A signal strike. A small team was sent into the remains of the Ganymede crater, now cold and sealed beneath a shell of fused metal and regrown synthetic armor. The place where it had all begun. Where the veil first tore. The team carried no explosives, no heavy arms. Just chaos. Devices built to pulse irregular emotion-coded frequencies. Memories encoded as math. Grief in sine waves. Love in shattered rhythm. Death as beauty. Madness as structure. They stepped into the ruins and found silence waiting. But not the still, suffocating kind. This was a silence that breathed. The walls flexed gently with unseen movement. The metal creaked not from pressure but from intention. The structure was listening. And it hated what it heard. As soon as the first pulse activated, the walls screamed. It wasn't sound. It was force. A wave of raw rejection, a psychic recoil. The machines buckled. 2 team members collapsed, blood leaking from their ears. The third stumbled forward, pressing the signal deeper into the network. The chaos spread like fire. For the first time, the enemy hesitated. Then it retaliated. The sky above Ganymede split open. It wasn't a ship. Not in any known sense. It was a structure. A presence. A geometry that unfolded from nothing, a fractal bloom that expanded in on itself even as it arrived. Its shape defied logic. It was visible from every angle, yet it cast no shadow. It hovered without support. It existed in a state of being that the brain refused to fully register. The ground shook. The ruins cracked. The signal pulsed back in full force. But something had changed. The humans did not flee. They stood in its gaze and screamed back. Not in fear. In rage. They fed their pain into the signal loop. The loss of Ganymede. The silence of friends. The mutilation of their species. All of it pulsed and projected into the air. A feedback loop of human fury. And the impossible structure above them began to crack. Not physically, perceptually. The shape flickered. The geometry stuttered. The illusion broke. It hadn't come from another place. It had been grown, a construct of thought, assembled from the collective fear of every species it had consumed. A parasite not of matter, but of meaning. It fed on belief. On obedience to pattern. And humans refused. They rebelled against everything. The thing tried to adapt. To mimic. But there was nothing consistent to copy. One human cried. Another laughed. A third stared into the void and whispered a lullaby. No formation. No unity. Just raw, beautiful defiance. The signal collapsed. The structure shattered without sound. It folded inward, collapsing into itself like a black star of memory. And where it had hovered, only dust remained. But this was only the beginning. The message had been sent. Across the solar system, other installations stirred. Bases long thought lost blinked back online. Distress calls that had been silent for years suddenly activated. The pulse had been seeded across every outpost, every moon, every forgotten satellite. And now, it was unraveling. The war wasn't over. It had just been declared. The dust didn't settle. It hung in the air like ash, refusing to fall, as if even gravity was hesitant to touch what remained. Where the impossible structure once stood, there was now only fractured stone and blackened steel. The crater pulsed faintly, but the signal was gone. The pattern had broken. The rhythm lost. The survivors stood there, breathing ragged, armor cracked, minds frayed. Some were bleeding from their ears, others shaking from overload, but they were still standing. That mattered. They hadn't just endured the collapse. They had caused it. Back on Earth, the transmissions were reviewed in silence. Analysts played back the waveform collapse again and again, unable to fully explain what they saw. The shape of the signal at the moment of implosion didn't resemble any known pattern. It wasn't just corrupted. It had evolved into something else. Something human. Something impossible to predict. It was grief and rage, humor and horror, contradiction as language. It had weaponized unpredictability, a linguistic virus that had taken down a cosmic intelligence that thought itself untouchable. And it had worked. But no one celebrated. Because the system stirred. The signal hadn't originated from Ganymede. It had only been a fracture in a larger design. The real network was far older, far wider. It didn't exist in one place. It was woven into the void itself. Buried in the frequencies of space, in the hiss of black holes, in the flicker of cosmic background radiation. And now, that signal was aware of Earth. It had noticed the resistance. And it didn't understand it. So it came to study it. The first probes appeared near the outer colonies, not machines, not organisms. Concepts. Shapes. Invasions of perception. A flicker in the corner of every eye. A wrong reflection in a still pool. People spoke to relatives who had been dead for years. Saw cities they had never visited. Heard laughter in the white noise. And the dreams returned. Shared, collective dreams. Billions of minds, touched by a whisper. The signal wasn't trying to kill humanity. It was trying to become humanity. The decision was made, fight back, not with weapons, but with what made humans unique. Imagination. They flooded the networks with stories. Unfiltered thoughts. Absurdities. Art, chaos, pain, irony. They coded viruses that made no logical sense, driven not by precision, but feeling. They crafted AI that laughed in impossible languages, that dreamed in spirals, that hallucinated joy. And the enemy faltered. Because it couldn't predict what didn't follow rules. It had consumed thousands of civilizations. All perfect. All orderly. All understandable. But not this one. This one made jokes about death. This one sang lullabies to the stars while bleeding from the chest. This one turned tragedy into poetry. The pulse recoiled again. But this time, it didn't collapse. It retaliated. Across Jupiter's moons, the old ruins awakened. Structures began assembling from dust and memory. Invisible towers rose from frozen plains, humming with a song that bent time. The sun dimmed for 3 seconds. Saturn's rings shifted position by 1 degree. Something was coming through. Not just thought. Not just pattern. But presence. A being began to form, not of flesh, not of metal, but of meaning. A concept of purity. Of perfection. A recursive God. It didn't roar. It didn't threaten. It simply stood tall and infinite, with a body of light and symmetry so perfect it hurt to look at. The last stand began on Europa. They gathered the broken. The damaged. The ones the signal had already touched but not yet claimed. And they sent them to the front. Because the enemy couldn't consume what it didn't understand. And nothing was more unknowable than a human soul broken and rebuilt. They marched into the light with pain in their veins and music in their helmets. Not war drums. Not commands. A song. Off key. Too loud. Beautiful in its ugliness. The signal screamed. The thing that wore perfection like a crown fractured at the edges. Its limbs stuttered. Its geometry lost cohesion. It tried to adapt, to replicate, to twist itself into something chaotic. But it couldn't fake it. It wasn't built to feel. So they flooded it with feeling. They streamed every funeral. Every betrayal. Every whispered confession. Every act of forgiveness. They turned trauma into thunder. Grief into fire. Laughter into war. The being collapsed. Its final act wasn't violence. It was a question. Not spoken in words. Just a sensation. Why would you choose pain? The answer came not in code, but in silence. And then a single human voice. Because it's real. And the sky tore open. Not from force, but from choice. The enemy didn't die. It left. It recoiled into the void that birthed it, unable to carry the weight of what it couldn't predict. Not because it feared humans, but because it couldn't become them. The signal faded. The geometry cracked. The stars brightened. The war was over. But no one felt victorious. Too many were lost. Too many were changed. The survivors didn't return as heroes. They returned as warnings. Not just to Earth. To the universe. That something had heard them. And decided to retreat. But it would never forget. And neither would humanity. So they built beacons not to warn others, but to remind themselves. Across the moons and the edges of space, etched into metal and stone, they carved the final words of the war. We are the noise. We are the broken. We are the virus you can't cure. We are humanity. And we never stop.